Good afternoon, and welcome to another edition of the I Prefer the 80s and 90s Sports Podcast. Spot podcast where I, Richard Harris, talk about why I prefer the sports of the 80s and the 90s to today. Today we're going to talk about rivalries. The strength of college football in the 80s and 90s were the rivalries, were the rivalry games. And you say, well, what's the rivalry? Rivalry game? That is the million-dollar question, and it is probably the crux of why I prefer the rivalries of the 80s and 90s to today, because they were more clear. We had Texas and Texas A&M, Alabama, Auburn, Michigan, Ohio State, Oklahoma, Oklahoma State. Those are natural rivalries because they play in the same state, and or in Michigan, Ohio State's case, they played in the same conference, and they usually are the two teams competing for supremacy. But what has happened in the last 10 years, is that three things have happened. Number one is expansion and teams moving from conference to conference. Number two, the natural rivals have been not as good. So, for example, in the Oregon State case, Oregon has exploded onto the college football scene to be a perennial power. Oregon State has had a couple of good years in recent years, but not to the extent of Oregon. And if the game is not played at the stadium where Oregon State plays, then the game tends not to be as competitive. UCLA, USC. USC has had some success in recent years. UCLA has not. Chip Kelly was brought to UCLA to make them an offensive team, juggernaut, that is, and they have not lived up to that hype. I'm distracted. I'm sorry. I'm watching Oregon play against Arizona State, and essentially a guy caught like a 10-yard pass and just ran 70 yards for a touchdown based on his speed and missed tackles. Oklahoma, Texas is the rivalry of the Big 12, and both teams have been really good. Oklahoma has been probably one of the 5 best programs in college football over the last 15 years. Texas has not. And so the games itself have been uneventful. And then the third thing is that teams that we thought and believed were the rivals aren't the rivals. Other teams feel that there are bigger rivalries and rivalry games than playing the natural rival. Florida and Florida State, they play each other every year. And recent years, the game has kind of not been the same. Miami and Florida State was the rivalry that everyone talked about, that everyone liked to see. But that's not the rivalry. The rivalry is supposed to be Florida versus Florida State. And so when Florida State and Miami both was really good in the 90s, that rivalry was something. And Tennessee and Florida play in the 80s and the 90s. That rivalry was special because it was a conference, and usually the person who won the conference. And Florida won a lot of them. Some rivalries have kept us interested. Alabama and Auburn, even when Auburn is not having a good season, they've been able to give Alabama fits. And so, to me, it just don't feel the same. And usually this time of year, late November, is when the rivalry games happen in state. It's usually the last game of the season because a lot of these teams don't play in the same conference. South Carolina and Clemson don't play in the same conference, but that's the rivalry. Florida and Florida State don't play in the same conference. That's their rivalry. Georgia and Georgia Tech don't play in the same conference. You get the drift. Then you get the Army and Navy game. That's probably the only game that is still widely accepted and loved and everybody gets into. But Texas and Texas A&M don't play anymore, and apparently starting next year, they're going to be in the same conference, so that'll get back to happening. Oklahoma and Oklahoma State not going to be playing each other anymore because Oklahoma is moving conferences. And money has changed everything in college sports. And people don't get it, don't care about it. They don't care if Texas and Texas A&M hasn't played in years. They don't care that certain teams are leaving conferences to go play their quote-unquote rival or natural rival other places. They don't care because there's more money somewhere else. Notre Dame has 4 rivals. Notre Dame used to play Michigan all the time. They don't play Michigan anymore. They play USC every year. That still happens. Stanford every year. And they play Navy every year. But Notre Dame used to play Penn State. That don't happen anymore. Boston College. The battle of the Catholic schools. Well, not necessarily Catholic school, but supposedly the religious schools. Don't happen anymore. And it's like, back in the day, those games meant something. A lot of these games today don't mean squat, except for a win-loss record. I miss Oklahoma. I miss Alabama and Auburn and Bo Jackson going against Alabama's defense. I missed the Florida-Tennessee game was the game to start the season. Every year, the third week in September, was Florida versus Tennessee. And that winner determined who was going to win the SEC. Alabama doesn't play Georgia unless they meet them in the conference championship. It's crazy. Those things happened in the 80s and the 90s. Not today. Ohio State and Michigan. I'll tell you another reason why the rivalry games don't mean as much. The rivalry games used to, Michigan and Ohio State would play. Michigan would win one year because it was on their field. Ohio State would win the next year because it was on their field. Now, it's like Ohio State had won, 8 in a row until 2 years ago? Now Michigan has won like the last 2. And so it's like teams have been dominated. Texas and Oklahoma. Oklahoma's won its share. Texas has won its share. But when a team wins a bunch in a row, not a rivalry anymore. It just seemed like in the 80s and 90s it went back and forth. And yes, in the 80s and 90s, Florida State and Miami played, and Miami would win because Florida State couldn't make a field goal. But you look forward to that game, and it was the middle of the season. And then when Florida was good, you look forward to the end of the season for the Florida State Florida game. Maybe it's the good weather here in LA that's kind of taken away the thrill of the rivalry games for me today. Because I don't feel like the college football season is coming to an end because the weather here in Los Angeles is so good that it's almost like it's September. I remember I used to watch the Egg Bowl, Mississippi and Mississippi State, Thanksgiving night. That was a fun game to watch with my friends at their house eating dinner. I believe that's still happening this year on Thanksgiving night. And being bad, rainy, nasty weather there, and be kind of cold and dank and rainy here. Maybe that's why I'm having issues with the rivalry games today. Because I don't feel like it's really almost the end of the year. Today is November 18th. We have 36 days to the end of the year. And some of these rivalries just flat out aren't worth watching. But I watch everything because I'm a sports nut. Anyway, we look forward to the bowl season. It's fascinating. In college basketball, there are rivalries, but they're conference rivalries, and you know the big one. Carolina Duke's the big one. There ain't too many other ones in other conferences because everyone's moved. Syracuse Georgetown was a big rivalry for years. Now Syracuse is in the ACC. Georgetown's not. And it makes more sense for Georgetown to be in the ACC than Syracuse because Georgetown is on I-95 in that area with all the ACC teams. But then again, Maryland is in the Big Ten. I mean, it's funny. Michigan State, Michigan should be a bigger rivalry than Michigan, Ohio State, but it's not. In fact, it's to the point where they can't even say each other's names. It's that school up north, that school down south. And some schools that have rivalries, say Colorado State, they play that early in the season because Colorado usually is better and it hasn't really been much of a rivalry. Utah State. Utah don't play Utah State. I mean, tonight we got what? Cal Stanford. That's a good rivalry game. But it don't mean the same in other sports. So in my conclusion, I'm kind of sad that the rivalry games and the rivalries have kind of gone astray because of conference realignment, money. One team one year is really good, and another year the team is not really good. Dominance of certain teams over other teams. It's not the same. In the 80s and 90s, I look forward to rivalry. I look forward to watching these games where teams went against each other for state supremacy. And it ain't coming back anytime soon because more realignment is happening. Texas, yeah, they'll start to play Texas A&M again. But Pac-12 is dissipating. The Big 12 is adding teams that make no sense for them to be there. All eyes are on the SEC and the ACC and the Big 10. And pretty soon, that's what's going to happen to the whole landscape of college sports, all because of football. There's just going to be super conferences all across the country. I mean, think about it. Next year, USC is going to be in the Big 10, and they're going to start playing Penn State and Rutgers. Don't make no sense. Arizona's going to be in the Big 12, and they're going to be playing against Cincinnati, West Virginia. You'd love it if you're the East Coast school because you get to fly out to the West. Arizona's always warm. That's why I'm laughing today watching Oregon play Arizona State. And Bo Nix has got already 5 touchdown passes for like 300 and something yards in the first half. Because the weather is good in Arizona. He can play. You got to worry about the wind, the snow, the rain. Just go out and play football. And if you got superior athletes in warm weather, you don't kill them. But I digress. Enjoy rivalry week for what it is, for the once was, and what it may never be. I'm trying to. I'm Richard Harris.